Hey, screenwriters. Today I want to talk about a book that's really impacted the way I approach the second act of my screenplays. It's a book that I've actually been meaning to read for years now, but I never got a chance to getting around to it till just recently. And it's one that I actually think that you should consider getting to help you power through the second act of your screenplay. So what's the book and why do I find it so interesting? Let's get into it. James Scott Bell wrote a book a few years ago called Writing Your Novel from the Middle. And I always found it was a really provocative title. I always found it was a really interesting concept. Never got a chance around to reading it till just recently. And I'm regretting having waited so long because I think this is a phenomenal book for screenwriters, not just for novelists. The thesis of the book is very simple. Bell's argument is that there is a moment of your screenplay that takes place in the middle of your story that is actually the most crucial moment of your entire narrative. And that's the moment where your character has an introspective moment where they reevaluate how their journey has been impacting them and what is going to happen to them if they don't change or if they don't rise to the occasion. It's a wonderful concept. It's a very powerful idea because it helps bring focus to your second act, something that I've always had great difficulty doing. The idea behind writing your novel from the middle is to find a moment that takes place in the middle of your narrative that forces your main character to have a reflective experience. Bell calls it a mirror moment, something that forces your character to look at the mirror and to reevaluate themselves in terms of how they're coping with the challenges that your story is throwing at them so far. It's that moment that defines what your feature is actually about, that defines what your script is actually about. Because that's the moment where the real stakes of the story are determined, where the real understanding of what that story is about is expressed to the audience. And that is such a provocative idea for me, because second acts have always been very difficult for me to write. I've always found them to be very unfocused. I know what the first act is about. I know what the third act is about. I understand what the big ideas there are. The first act is about establishing a world. The third act is about resolution. The second act has always been very murky to me. Well, this book helps bring clarity to what my second act should be because it gives me a guidepost. It gives me an idea of there's a critical element that has to happen in the second act of your movie to make your story worthwhile. And Bell's argument is that moment is called a mirror moment. It's a moment where your main character looks at themselves in the mirror and has to evaluate for themselves what will happen to them if they don't get what they want in this story, if they don't reach their objectives. So, what is that mirror moment and why is it so important? Now, James Scott Bell's entire thesis is based on the idea that your mirror moment of your story is actually driven by death, your character trying to overcome death. And he defines death in the book in very specific ways. There's 3 ways for your character to die. Number 1 is physical, so literal death. Your character, if he doesn't get out of the house, the haunted house, are going to die. If they don't escape from the terrorists, are going to die. If they don't stop Thanos from snapping his fingers, they're going to die. Death in the most literal and physical sense. The second is professional, that your character's career ambitions is at stake. Whether they're going to lose their job or not get the job that they want, not get the career satisfaction they're looking for. Professional death is how Bell defines that. The third way for your character to die is psychologically. There's something that is going to psychologically change in your main character if they don't overcome their obstacles. Maybe they're going to be driven crazy. Maybe they're going to have to transform who they are as a person at a fundamental level. A great example of this would be, let's say, A Christmas Carol, where Scrooge starts off as sort of a greedy capitalist. He ends up in the third act as someone very generous, but that transformation means that the Scrooge that we meet in Act 1 actually dies throughout the story. He's reborn as someone else. So there's a psychological death that's at stake as well. So the mirror moment is the moment where your character realizes that if they don't overcome the obstacles that they're being faced with, they are also having to reconcile their own death, that they may die in some capacity, either physically, either professionally, or psychologically. So it's a wonderful concept, and Bell describes it as a triangle. At the top of that triangle is your mirror moment. This side of your triangle is your pre-story psychology, how your character enters Act 1, their fears, their phobias, their insecurities, their conceptualization of what the world is. The other end of the triangle is the transformation. Your character goes through from the pre-story psychology, hits the mirror moment, and then transforms into something else at the end of their story. It's a neat idea. It's a great way to encapsulate what a story structure should be when you're considering a mirror moment. And it really helped me come to terms with the fact that I have to really understand my character's psychology as they enter page 1 of my script, because that psychology is going to determine their mirror moment, which is what's going to determine the transformation. It's a really neat concept. It's a very short and simple book. Like, I would really recommend getting it, especially if you're a writer that's always struggled with second acts like me. I think this is a great book to use in terms of helping you craft that second act, helping you understand what your story is actually about, and how to have a character transformation that's going to be very powerful for the audience. James Scott Bell, Write Your Novel from the Middle. I highly suggest it. One caveat though, the references that Bell uses in the novel are a little dated. It hasn't been revised in several years, so don't be surprised if you're coming across references of Casablanca or Lethal Weapon or Gone with the Wind. It's just the age of the book, but the idea behind it, the thesis of this book is still valid, and it still, I think, is highly applicable to screenwriting today. So that's it. That's my video on James Scott Bell's Write Your Novel from the Middle. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, drop them in the box below. Happy writing.